Tonight, I wear a hat. James wears a hat. And Richard is behind a low wall. Tonight, I wear a hat. Richard wears a hat. And James wears a hat. Tonight, Richard wears a blue hat. James wears a different hat. And I wear a hat with things on it. Welcome to the Grand Tour, and in this week's programme, I drive a saloon car. James drives a catering lorry. And Richard has a knife fight.
Let's dance.
A tree falls over. A hedgehog makes a noise. And a dog eats some meat. I try to pull a camel. Come on, come on. A donkey pulls James. And Richard gets stuck in a cow orgy.
I really am alarmed.
I eat some cheddar. Richard says he doesn't want any.
I don't want cheese.
And James compares a Ford GT40 to a Ferrari P3.
Avante!
Richard walks a dog. James hangs around a gym. And I say, good shot. Good shot. James runs over a sun lounger. Richard has a beer. And I go on a thing. I urinate on an engine. Richard wears an anorak. And James takes drugs. An ant in a jar. A dog on a lead. And some beans on a table. James falls over. Ow! James falls over again. And James falls over. James stands in a park. I panic in a shop. And Richard is touched by a man. All that is coming later.
It is not.
I drive the Bugatti Chiron in Saint-Tropez. And in the Alps. And through the streets of Turin. Richard chooses his favourite waterfall.
I like that big one.
James waters a stranger's barbecue. And I put some dust on a girl. A shopping centre. An explosion. And a man banging a pole. Richard steals some sun cream. I drink some wine. And James says 40.
40?
A maroon Skoda. A silver car of some sort. And an elderly German man says, I don't like jumps.
I don't like jumps.
James May changes gear. Richard Hammond changes gear. And I... change gear. James wears a red anorak. Richard looks at a pipe of some sort. And I make a cup of tea. Richard reads a map. James wears a hat. And I remember how old I am. I'm 57. James wears glasses. I pretend to be a dog. And a terrorist eats a savoury snack. Abby is sideways on ice in a 911 Turbo. Richard drives Jim Clark's beautiful Lotus 25, and I nearly fall over. A supercar is dismantled for no reason. A man with no shirt on. And my whole tongue is wrapped up in intestine.
My whole tongue is wrapped up in intestine.
Locke, Scott, and two smoking Beamers. Neil Armstrong walks on the moon. Some angry cyclists. And I throw a sandwich out of the window. A young woman changes a wheel. An older woman drinks some lager. And Richard looks at a book.
Look at that.
James stands next to a car. Richard pulls a face. And some Toblerone falls over. Richard operates a bat. James sits in a car humming. And I park outside a cathedral. Tonight, James May thinks he's a racing driver. Richard Hammond thinks he's Jesus. And I think I'm going to be killed. James May faces trial by water. Richard Hammond faces trial by fire. And I drive a Ferrari on the moon. Richard tries to start a motorbike. James fills his car with petrol. And I get a British Rail suntan. We throw a chair over a hedge. A quite interesting man drives our reasonably priced car. And for the first time ever, the Bugatti Veyron races the McLaren F1. We shout at the government. A man drives a Subaru through a building. And a dog goes in a car. I wear some goggles. Richard falls down a small slope. And James says hello to a man.
All right, mate.
Richard has a crisis. Some sheep on our track. And James and I go to the laboratory. James gets lost in a Lamborghini. Richard drives over a bridge in a Ferrari. And I wear a small hat in an Aston Martin.
They're on fire.
James catches fire. Richard knocks something over. And I crash a Reliant Robin into a lamppost. I wear a hat. Richard wears a hat. And James wears a hat. Richard wears a towel. James and I eat some crisps. And a fly is in our reasonably priced car. A dog won't get in a car. A flip chart falls over. And a man from Liverpool drives a car. A sausage gets burnt. A sheep falls over. And our track is all wet. A fat man gets murdered. A donkey gets overtaken. And James wears ladies' underwear on his head. Our track's a bit foggy. A man eats a snack. And we move about in a caravan. Richard wears a blue hat. James wears a different hat. And I wear a hat with things on it. Richard Hammond buys a cup of coffee. James May slips on some snow.
I hate snow.
And we show a picture of Steve McQueen. I find a bicycle in a river. James annoys a dog. And Richard jumps over a dike. I talk to two old ladies. Richard makes a phone call. And James sniffs his own armpit. I use a machine. James writes on a blackboard. And Richard lobs fruit into a caravan. I talk to a man in sunglasses. James draws a square on a wall. And Richard plays with a soldier's chopper. James asks a girl for a favour.
No.
Richard listens to a man. And I polish a bishop. I do a skid. Richard steals some tyres. And James gets kicked in the face. I drive around a field. James measures a runway. And Richard lays a cable. I wear a hat. James wears a hat. And Richard is behind a low wall. I point at a fig. Richard walks through a shop. And James has some bananas. I stop for petrol. Richard wears some sunglasses. And James sees some shirts. James draws on a board. Richard waves at a man. And I run away from a table. I hold up a jar. James points at a hill. And Richard eats a sandwich. I play tennis. Richard points at a minibus. And James shakes hands with two men. Dog looks over a wall. We drive some chairs. And the Stig does a skid in a supercharged Jag. I eat a cabbage. James throws a bird out of a car. And Richard forgets the abbreviation for America.
USB.
I sit on a rock. James gets something in his eye. And Richard says, "Mommy!" Richard opens a glove box. James pulls a face. And I ask an important question. Have you ever put toothpaste on your testicle? I move my eyes. Richard vandalizes a road.
There you go.
And James says cow.
Cow!
Richard tests a van. I drive an old brown Porsche. And James uses a telephone.